10 years after losing his wife, Connor finally agreed to walk into a restaurant for his first date. But less than an hour later he came home alone, with two carefully folded menus tucked inside his jacket pocket. The next morning, CEO Charlotte watched them slip out of the folder Connor carried into her office. She picked the menus up, her expression shifting into something unreadable. "You told me last night was a date," she said slowly. "So why did you bring two menus home?" Connor said nothing at first, and the silence between them stretched longer than either expected. But Connor's answer would reveal that the previous night had nothing to do with what Charlotte assumed, and everything changed. The headquarters of Hartwell Group occupied the upper floors of a glass tower that caught the last gold light of a Friday afternoon in Chicago. Connor moved through the executive corridor with a toolbox in one hand and a work order in the other, checking the air handling system that fed the top-floor conference rooms. A younger technician named Marcus leaned against the doorway and grinned, the way he always did when he had something to say that Connor would rather not hear. "You know they tried to set you up again. Denise from accounting, third time this year." "You said no before she even finished the sentence." Connor tightened a valve and did not look up. "I heard her out for 4 seconds. Connor allowed himself a small laugh and let the subject drop the way he always did. It was easier than explaining, and there was very little left to explain that people around the office did not already assume. They knew, in the vague way that colleagues know things about each other, that his wife had died. They did not know the shape of the years that followed, the quiet architecture of a life rebuilt entirely around a child and a job with nothing set aside for anything else. It had been nearly 10 years, long enough that grief no longer arrived as a wave but as weather, present in the background of an ordinary day without announcing itself. In that time, Connor had raised his daughter largely on his own, had learned to fix nearly anything in a building that did not want to be fixed, and had built a life that worked even if it was not particularly full. His daughter was older now, away at school, and the apartment he came home to each night had grown steadily quieter, the kind of quiet that settled into corners and stayed there. Marcus shook his head, still grinning, and wandered off toward the service elevator, leaving Connor alone with the humming machinery and his own thoughts. Most nights he cooked for one, ate at the counter instead of the table, and fell asleep with the television murmuring in the background because the silence otherwise felt too complete. He had never minded the routine of it. He had simply never noticed how thoroughly it had replaced everything else. Charlotte happened to be walking past the open door when she caught the tail end of the conversation. She was the chief executive of Hartwell Group, and she had known Connor for years in the specific way that a CEO knows a person who fixes things without ever causing a scene, a man whose competence she trusted completely and whose personal life she had never once considered. She paused, curious despite herself. "You really haven't been on a date in 10 years?" she asked, half amused, leaning against the frame Marcus had just vacated. Connor straightened up, unbothered by the question in a way that suggested he had heard some version of it many times. "It's not that I hate the idea," he said. "I think I just forgot how you're supposed to start." Charlotte studied him for a moment longer than the question required, something flickering behind her eyes that she did not examine too closely. Then she said something light about how starting was always the hardest part of anything, and walked on toward her office, the exchange already folding itself into the ordinary texture of the day. That evening, a message arrived on Connor's phone from an old acquaintance who had been trying for months to introduce him to someone. The woman's name was Hannah, and she managed a small restaurant not far from his apartment. Connor read the message twice, felt the familiar pull toward saying no, and then, for reasons he could not entirely name, typed back that he would be there the following night at 7. He set the phone down on the counter afterward and stood there for a while, half surprised at himself, wondering what exactly had made this the moment he finally said yes. Connor arrived at the restaurant nearly 20 minutes early, a habit born less from eagerness than from nerves he refused to name. He sat at the bar first, ordering water because he could not decide whether the evening called for wine or coffee, and the indecision itself felt like proof of how far out of practice he was. He wore a dark suit he had not touched in years, and though it still fit, he felt strangely costumed inside it, like a man playing a part he only half remembered. When Hannah arrived, she was warm and easy to talk to, dressed simply, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who managed a busy dining room every night and had long since stopped being nervous about first impressions. There was nothing about her that gave Connor any reason for caution. She laughed easily, asked good questions, and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. The restaurant itself was small and unpretentious, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and candles burned down to uneven stubs, the sort of warmth that made a person forget briefly to be anxious. Somewhere behind them a server dropped a tray, and the room laughed together in the easy way strangers sometimes do, and for a moment Connor almost relaxed. They talked for a while about ordinary things, the restaurant, the neighborhood, the strange rhythms of Chicago winters. Connor offered little about his past, answering questions with short, careful sentences that revealed just enough to keep the conversation moving without opening any door too wide. Hannah noticed. She had spent enough evenings across from enough people to recognize when someone was speaking around the edges of something rather than through the middle of it. Halfway through the meal, while scanning the menu for dessert, Connor asked a question before he fully realized he was asking it. "Do you ever order something just because someone else used to love it?" Hannah set her menu down slowly. She understood, without being told directly, that he was not talking about her. A quiet settled over the table, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavier than anything that had come before it. Hannah let it sit for a moment before speaking. "I think you might be ready for something new," she said gently. "But I also think part of you is still asking the old part of your life for permission to move on." Connor did not argue with her. He turned his glass slowly on the table and found that he had no rebuttal at all, because some quiet part of him had been waiting for someone else to say it out loud. The evening did not end in an argument or a scene. Nothing about it broke. It simply arrived, gently and without cruelty, at the understanding that Connor had walked into that restaurant not entirely certain whether he was trying to meet someone new or trying to prove to himself that he had survived someone leaving. They parted on good terms, without bitterness, the kind of ending that leaves no scar because nothing was ever mishandled. Before Hannah returned to the kitchen, Connor asked, almost sheepishly, if he could keep 2 of the paper menus from the table. She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but did not press him for a reason. She simply nodded and told the host to wrap 2 extra copies for him. Connor folded them carefully along their creases and slid them into his jacket pocket, the way a man might carry something fragile through a crowd. He offered no explanation. He did not fully have one himself, not yet, only a feeling that he needed to keep both, and that whatever came next would depend on understanding why. He walked home slowly that night, past darkened storefronts and the quiet clatter of the elevated train somewhere overhead, turning the evening over in his mind without arriving anywhere near a conclusion. Monday morning arrived with the usual weight of a new week, and Connor was summoned upstairs before he had even finished his coffee. The board conference room was having trouble with its audio and display systems, and with an important meeting scheduled for later that morning, the request carried a note of real urgency. Connor gathered his service binder and headed for the executive floor, moving quickly through the corridor he had walked 1,000 times before. When he set the binder down on Charlotte's desk to check a wiring diagram, 2 folded pieces of paper slipped out from between the pages and landed near her keyboard. Charlotte glanced down out of simple reflex, and something in her expression shifted the moment she recognized the restaurant's name printed across the top. She remembered, with sudden clarity, that this was the place Connor had mentioned only days earlier, the place where he was finally going to have his first date in nearly a decade. A curiosity rose in her that she recognized, somewhere in the back of her mind, as slightly more personal than professional distance should allow. She picked up the menus carefully, turning them over once in her hands. "You told me that night was a date," she said, her voice light but pointed. Connor nodded, saying nothing yet, unsure where the conversation was headed. Charlotte looked at the 2 folded pages for a moment before speaking again. "So why did you bring 2 menus home?" Connor was quiet for several seconds, long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of answer, the kind that makes a listener brace for something complicated. It would have been easy to assume the obvious, that there had been 2 women that night, or some tangled situation Connor was reluctant to explain. The truth was nothing like that at all. He explained, slowly, that years earlier his wife had once mentioned wanting to try that particular restaurant, though the 2 of them had never managed to go together before she passed. During his date, scanning the menu out of nervous habit, Connor had noticed a dish she had once described wanting to order, and something in him had frozen at the sight of it. He had asked for one menu to keep for himself, a small memento of the evening. The second, he explained, he had intended to set beside an old photograph of his wife for a single night, not because he wanted to live inside the past, but because he felt he owed the past one final, honest goodbye before he let himself move toward anything new. "I figured," he said quietly, That before I started a new chapter, I should actually say goodbye to the old one properly, not just walk away from it. Charlotte stood very still. The answer landed somewhere she had not expected, striking with far more weight than the simple curiosity that had prompted her question in the first place. She had asked expecting an awkward story, maybe something worth a private laugh later, and instead she found herself standing across from a grief so carefully tended that it had become a kind of quiet discipline. She set the menus down gently on the desk, as though they had suddenly become something fragile. For the first time since she had known him, Charlotte did not look at Connor as an employee whose competence she relied upon without much further thought. She looked at him, briefly and unmistakably, as a man. She cleared her throat after a moment, composing herself, and asked him to continue with the wiring diagram as though nothing unusual had happened at all, though something clearly had, quietly, in the space between one sentence and the next. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between Charlotte and Connor shifted in small but unmistakable ways. Charlotte began finding reasons to talk with him longer than any maintenance request strictly required, though nothing about it felt staged or dramatic. It showed up instead in ordinary moments, the kind that meant little on their own but accumulated quietly into something larger. Connor fixed the espresso machine in the executive lounge one afternoon, and Charlotte lingered nearby longer than necessary, asking questions about the machine that she did not particularly need answered. Another evening, both of them stayed late finishing separate tasks and found themselves standing near the same window looking out at the lit grid of the city below. "Did that date mean you're ready to start again?" Charlotte asked, her tone carefully casual, her eyes fixed on the skyline rather than on him. "I think it meant I'm ready to try," Connor answered. Charlotte turned her face away for a moment, unwilling to let him see how much the simple honesty of that answer affected her. Later, it was Connor who asked about her life outside the office, a question he had never quite had the standing to ask before. Charlotte told him, somewhat to her own surprise, about an engagement that had ended years earlier. The man she had almost married, she explained, had seemed to love the idea of marrying Charlotte Hartwell, chief executive, far more than he had ever loved the woman underneath the title. When the engagement fell apart, she had simply stopped dating altogether, finding it easier to trust spreadsheets than people. Two individuals who might have seemed entirely different on the surface began to recognize something familiar in each other. Connor feared that loving someone new meant somehow betraying the memory of the woman he had lost. Charlotte feared that anyone who wanted her now would only ever want the version of her that came with a corner office and a company behind her name. Both of them had spent years building careful, orderly lives around those fears, and neither had expected the other to see straight through the arrangements so easily. Neither of them said any of this outright. It surfaced instead in the small, careful questions they asked one another, in the pauses that lasted a beat too long, in the way conversations that should have ended kept finding reasons to continue. There was a particular evening, a heavy rain drumming against the tall windows, when Charlotte found Connor coiling cable in an empty conference room long after most of the floor had emptied out. She did not have any real reason to be there either, and both of them seemed to understand that without needing to say it. They talked instead about nothing important, the price of parking downtown, a documentary Connor had watched twice, a mistake Charlotte had made early in her career that she had never told anyone else at the company. The conversation moved easily, the way conversations do between two people who have quietly decided to stop guarding themselves quite so carefully. Not everyone in the building missed what was happening. Ryan, the chief financial officer, began to notice how often Connor was called to the executive floor outside any documented schedule, and how differently Charlotte spoke about him compared to anyone else on the maintenance staff. Ryan filed the observation away quietly, the way a man does when he is looking for leverage rather than the truth, and said nothing yet to anyone. He simply watched, patient in the way ambitious people often are, waiting for the right moment to make the observation useful. One night, the backup power system on the executive floor failed without warning, tripping alarms across half the building. Connor stayed late to troubleshoot the fault, tracing it panel by panel until he found the source. Charlotte remained as well, preparing for a major acquisition that needed her full attention regardless of what the building's electrical system decided to do. By the time Connor finished resetting the last breaker, it was well past 9, and nearly every restaurant near the office had already closed for the night. Charlotte suggested ordering food instead, and within 30 minutes a delivery arrived in the empty lobby. "If you call it a meeting," Connor said, setting the boxes down on the long table, I'll agree to eat with you. Charlotte smiled despite herself. Then this is officially a meeting with pizza. Outside, the city had gone dark blue with evening, the lights of distant buildings scattered like something spilled across glass. They ate together in the empty boardroom, surrounded by darkened monitors and the low hum of restored power. The conversation began in familiar, professional territory but slowly drifted somewhere more personal, the way conversations tend to when two tired people run out of reasons to hold back. Charlotte admitted, somewhat to her own embarrassment, that on the night of Connor's date she had thought about it far more than she probably should have. Connor looked at her, one eyebrow raised. Were you jealous? Charlotte denied it immediately, too quickly for the denial to be entirely convincing. Connor laughed, an easy, genuine sound. It was the first time he had ever teased his company's chief executive, and something about the moment dissolved a distance that had stood between them for years without either of them ever naming it. Charlotte asked if he still had both menus. Only one now, Connor said. She looked surprised. He explained that after that first night, he had placed the menu meant for his late wife inside a small box where he kept a handful of things from their years together, sealing that particular chapter with something close to peace. The second menu, however, had stayed in his jacket pocket ever since. Charlotte asked why. I think I figured I might need it again someday, Connor said, to remind myself that I actually did start over and didn't just talk about it. Something passed between them then, quiet and unmistakable, the kind of moment that seemed to be leaning toward a first kiss neither of them had quite decided to admit they wanted. The air in the boardroom felt suddenly smaller, more private than the space actually was. For a beat, neither of them reached for their phone or their papers, or any of the usual excuses that might have let them retreat from what was building, and the stillness between them said more than either had managed all evening. Charlotte's phone rang before either of them moved. It was Ryan, his voice clipped and urgent, informing her that several board members were demanding an emergency call before morning. Whatever had been building between them broke apart instantly, replaced by the familiar, colder weight of company business arriving exactly when it was least welcome. Charlotte apologized with her eyes more than her words, gathering her things quickly, while Connor simply nodded and began clearing the empty boxes from the table, the moment already folding itself away into something unfinished. Ryan had noticed over the previous weeks how often Connor was summoned to the executive floor outside any documented maintenance schedule. He began quietly raising the pattern with select members of the board, framing it not as gossip but as a governance concern, the kind of language that made accusations sound like due diligence. There was no suggestion of anything improper in the traditional sense, no scandal to whisper about in hallways. The conflict Ryan constructed was aimed instead at something more corrosive, a question about power and professional judgment, about whether the company's chief executive could be trusted to separate personal feeling from operational decisions. In a tense meeting the following week, Ryan raised the issue directly, asking whether recent decisions involving the facilities and operations team had been influenced by what he called a personal relationship. He cited nothing specific, no memo, no altered budget line, only a pattern of visits and a change in tone that he insisted the board could not simply overlook. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to dismiss the concern outright even though none of them had any real evidence to point to. Charlotte was furious, though she understood, even through her anger, that a publicly traded company could not simply wave away a question like that without consequence. She answered every question calmly, pointing out that the facilities budget had not changed in over a year, and that Connor held no authority over any decision that touched company finances. Still, she left the meeting knowing the accusation itself, however thin, had already done its damage simply by being spoken aloud in a room full of people who profited from doubt. Connor overheard part of the exchange by accident, catching fragments of it through a door left slightly open. Rather than wait for the situation to escalate further, he made a quiet decision of his own and requested a transfer to another Hartwell facility across the city. Charlotte summoned him to her office as soon as she heard. "Are you running away?" she asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "I'm protecting you," Connor answered. "I never asked you to protect me." "That's exactly the problem," Connor said. "The people who matter to me have never had to ask." Charlotte went very still at the phrase, the weight of it landing somewhere she had not braced for. "So what am I to you?" She asked quietly, did not answer. He simply turned and left the office, the question hanging unresolved in the space he left behind, and Charlotte stood alone for a long moment, unsure whether she was more angry at Ryan, at Connor or at herself for not knowing how to stop either of them. She sat down slowly at her desk, staring at the two menus still tucked into the corner of her drawer where she had placed them weeks earlier, unable to quite bring herself to throw them away or return them. For the first time since the accusation had surfaced, she allowed herself to admit that the fear driving Connor away was not really about the board at all. It was the same fear that had kept him from dating for 10 years, dressed up now in the language of protecting her instead. She understood the impulse even as it frustrated her, because she recognized the same instinct in herself, the habit of retreating into duty whenever something felt too big or too uncertain to hold on to directly. In the days that followed, Charlotte kept turning Connor's words over in her mind, and slowly she began to see the shape of what he was actually doing. For 10 years he had turned responsibility into a shield, a reason to avoid living fully for himself. Now he was doing the same thing again, wrapping his retreat from her in the language of protection, running from something real before it had the chance to truly begin. She decided to look more closely into the claims Ryan had raised, and what she found confirmed what she had already suspected. Ryan had exaggerated a handful of ordinary interactions into something far more significant than they were, using the situation as leverage in a larger struggle for influence within the company that had little to do with Connor at all. There was no unusual compensation, no irregular promotion, nothing in Connor's file that suggested any favoritism whatsoever. She spent an entire evening going through years of records, comparing Connor's assignments and pay history against every other technician on staff, and found the pattern to be almost boringly consistent. Charlotte compiled a clear, transparent record and brought it before the board herself, laying out every fact without embellishment, refusing to let anger creep into her voice even though it would have been justified. Several board members admitted, quietly and somewhat sheepishly, that they had allowed Ryan's framing to carry more weight than the evidence supported. It was a small victory, but an important one, and it left Charlotte with a clearer picture of exactly how fragile trust could be inside a company built on appearances. Ryan was not removed from the company in some dramatic immediate gesture, but his influence over certain decisions was curtailed, and an internal review was opened into how the accusation had been raised in the first place. When the meeting ended, Charlotte did not go looking for Connor as the company's chief executive. She drove herself, without an assistant or a driver, to the facility where he had requested his transfer, arriving just as he was finishing his first shift there. The building was smaller and older than headquarters, tucked into a quieter part of the city, and she sat in her car for a moment before going in, gathering something like courage she rarely needed for anything else in her life. Connor looked up, visibly startled to see her standing in the doorway of the maintenance office. "I settled things with the company," Charlotte said. "So why are you here?" Connor asked. Charlotte held his gaze steadily. "To settle the other thing." Connor set down the wrench he had been holding and simply looked at her, as if trying to decide whether to let himself believe she had actually come all this way for him. Charlotte did not declare her feelings outright. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a printed copy of the menu from the very restaurant where Connor had gone on his first date. Connor let out a surprised laugh. "What is this?" "You had your first date in 10 years, Charlotte said, holding the paper out to him. "I want the second one." Connor's expression sobered quickly. He told her honestly that if they were going to do this, he did not want Charlotte to have to hide any part of it, not from the board, not from anyone. Charlotte, in turn, admitted that she did not want Connor stepping into anything simply out of gratitude or loneliness, feelings that could easily be mistaken for something deeper than they were. They talked it through carefully, standing there in the maintenance office among tool carts and spare parts, agreeing that if they pursued this, they would do so outside company walls and with boundaries clear enough that no one, including themselves, could later claim confusion. Connor suggested that he remain at the new facility for the time being, at least until the internal review had closed, and Charlotte agreed, recognizing the wisdom in it even though some part of her wanted to argue against any distance between them at all. "I'm not doing this because I feel like I owe you something," Connor added quietly. "I want to be clear about that." Charlotte nodded. "I know. That's exactly why I drove here myself instead of sending someone else to talk you out of leaving." "Does the chief executive normally ask her employees out like this?" Connor asked, a hint of a smile returning to his face. "I've never tried it before," Charlotte admitted. "Then we're both new at this." They returned together to the same restaurant a few nights later. Charlotte deliberately chose a different table from the one Connor had shared with Hannah, a small gesture that carried more weight than its size suggested. This was not an attempt to erase what had come before. It was the beginning of something built fresh, a new memory laid down rather than a replacement for an old one. Connor noticed the choice and said nothing about it, but something in his chest eased slightly. A small private gratitude he did not know how to put into words yet. The host seated them near the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply taking in the strangeness and the rightness of being there together, in a place that had once marked an ending and now seemed poised to mark a beginning instead. Outside, the evening traffic moved past in slow glowing lines, and the candle between them flickered against the glass, doubling itself in the reflection. A server approached and set 2 menus down on the table between them. Connor looked at them and smiled, a small private amusement crossing his face, the kind of smile that belonged only to him and whatever memory had just surfaced. Charlotte noticed. "Are you planning on taking both of these home again this time?" "No," Connor said simply. "Why not?" He looked at her directly. "Last time I brought 2 menus home because someone couldn't sit across from me anymore." He slid one of the menus gently toward her side of the table. "This time the person on the other side is already here." For a long moment neither of them said anything else. The candlelight moved across the table between them, and somewhere behind Connor a couple laughed too loudly at a joke neither Charlotte nor Connor could hear. And none of it mattered because the only conversation that counted was the one happening between them. Connor admitted that he had once believed loving someone again would somehow diminish what he had shared with his late wife, as though there were only so much love available, and giving any of it away now would be a kind of theft from the past. He understood now that a heart did not need to erase one story simply to make room for another, that the 2 things could sit side by side without either one crowding out the other. Charlotte confessed her own fear in return, the quiet dread that had followed her since her broken engagement, the fear that anyone drawn to her would only ever be drawn to Charlotte Hartwell, chief executive, and never to the woman underneath that name. She had guarded that fear so carefully for so long that saying it aloud felt almost like setting down something heavy she had forgotten she was still carrying. She asked Connor directly whether he could care for her without caring at all about the company or the title attached to it. Connor answered without hesitation. "Whatever it was that made me notice you, it was never written on your office door." They kissed then, for the first time, unhurried and quiet, without spectacle or drama, the kind of kiss that belongs to 2 adults who have already done the harder work of being honest with each other first. When they finally pulled apart, Charlotte laughed softly, a little breathless, and Connor reached across the table to fold his hand around hers. The 2 menus still sitting there between them, no longer symbols of an ending, but simply part of the evening's ordinary, happy clutter. A year later, life had settled into something steady and unremarkable in the best possible way. Connor no longer reported through any department under Charlotte's direct authority, a change made early on to remove any question of conflict from the arrangement entirely. He still worked in the trade he had always loved, moving through buildings with a toolbox in hand, and had no particular interest in trading that life for a corner office or a title he had never wanted. Charlotte and Connor remained together, quietly and without fanfare, the kind of relationship that had grown steadier with time rather than louder. They had settled into small shared rituals, Sunday mornings spent at the same diner near his apartment, weekday calls that lasted longer than either of them intended, the ordinary rhythms that make a life feel shared rather than merely adjacent. Connor's daughter, now settled into her own life away from home, had met Charlotte briefly during a visit and had accepted her father's happiness with an ease that put to rest whatever quiet worry he had carried about introducing someone new into their small family. One evening, Charlotte stopped by Connor's apartment and, while searching for a charger in a kitchen drawer, came across an old folded menu tucked beneath a stack of receipts. She recognized it instantly as the one Connor had carried home from his very first date, the one that had once fallen out of his binder and landed on her desk. "You still have this?" she asked, holding it up with a small, amused smile. Connor walked over and without a word pulled a second menu from a nearby drawer, setting it down beside the first. Charlotte glanced between the 2. "So now you have 2 again?" Connor smiled. "One reminds me that I was finally ready to say goodbye." He picked up the second and placed it gently in her hand. "This one reminds me why I started over in the first place." Charlotte rested her head against his shoulder, and for a while neither of them said anything more, content simply to stand together in the quiet kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, and somewhere outside a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling before disappearing again. The two menus lay side by side on the counter, not as symbols of two different women, but as two chapters belonging to the same man, each one honored in its turn, each one making room for the other.